We ready. We ready. We ready for y'all. Man, I should take music classes, bro. But I'm just saying, I'm just saying though, but this is the begin of this week's boxing predictions, bro. Let's go. Round of applause, man. Round of applause. Let's go. Because I'm excited, and shit like that. So if you guys made a round of applause because I'm excited, do so, because that would mean a lot, and shit like that, but yeah, man, and shit like that, but this one is going to be between Alberto Puello versus Subriel Matias, and shit like that. This fight, man, oh my gosh, bro, I was ticking for this moment. Beautiful sky, literally everything, bro, for this fucking prediction, bro. Like, I am just saying, like, I've been waiting for this shit, like, literally, like, I am just saying, and, like, bruh, and shit like that, so it's like, man, dude, I'm very hyped for this fight. Like, man, my adrenaline is rushing, bro, like, literally it's rushing, like, I'm just saying, like, don't quote me, bro. All the Russian people out there, I love y'all, bro. And shit like that, But I'm just saying though, and shit like that, you feel me? And shit like that, But like, I've been waiting for this fight because this is a really good fight. Overall, I'm a fan of both of these fighters. Both of these fighters, and shit like that, didn't really like impress me too much, and shit like that, More of Alberto Puello, and shit like that, in my opinion. But genuinely, both of them, and shit like that, because I mean, obviously, Subriel Matias, he's coming off of his, loss against Liam Perot, which I'm just gonna say this right now, bro. Nobody has said this, but like in shit like that besides me right now, bro. Like, literally. And it's now gonna be live, and shit like that. Subriel won that fight, bro. Subriel won that fight. I am just saying, like, I ain't gonna lie and shit like that. Like, I can understand, like, different ways of how people can, think that, that Perot won. But it's just more of, like, at the same time, Subriel was the champion in Puerto Rico, and shit like that, and, like, literally, and it's like, and basically, like, that's the thing and shit like that, and it's like, he lost the fight. Like, he didn't lose that fight, man. I felt like Subriel did enough to winning that fight. Like, it's just like every single punch that Subriel did, like hit Liam Perot with, it was significant, and it won him the exchange. Sometimes, because Perot would win the exchanges, so Subriel Matias, he would have to, throw more punches and think more, and shit like that under pressure, and shit like that, But at the same time, though, and shit like that, he won, like he did enough to winning that fight. Because I watched this fight like two times, bro, and shit like that. Like, the first time I watched this fight and shit like that, I had Subriel winning that fight, and shit like that. It was like a 7 rounds to 5, and shit like that, or it was like a draw. But either way, like, it was like out of that. But the second time I seen that fight, Subriel clearly won that fight. Like, literally, it's like Subriel is that dude, man. Like, I am just saying, who at 140 is going to be able to fuck with Subriel like that? Nobody. Unless if you're trying to, like to just give somebody trying to just hand somebody a win over Subriel. Because, I mean, I am just saying, bro. Like, literally, like, I feel like, the one dude that the other guy that Subriel lost to, I forgot his name and shit like that, but he already beat him the second time, Subriel. But I feel like he put up a more of a tougher fight than Liam Perot. But I will say that in that fight, Subriel, like, didn't really try very much, because of rumors and shit like that, because I mean, he was saying that, like, you know, he didn't really have any urgency in that fight because of what happened to, rest in peace, Maxim Dadashev in the Dadashev fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing and shit like that, you know. So it's just like he didn't want any of that to happen, you know, and shit like that. And I remember that fight, you know, because it was on the Teofimo Lopez versus the Masayoshi Nakatani undercard. Like that was I believe that was the co-main for that fight, you know, and shit like that, you know, because I was once again in Ocean Shores at the time because I was like during it like an event with my parents and shit like that, you know. But you know, but basically you know, Subriel Matias, you know, and shit like that, you know, like, you know, honestly, it was a good fight, but it just Subriel like obviously won, and it's just the power was too much because every punch, like even when he blocked the punches, it's just like it was too much for Dadashev, and it just, I really feel like that the refs that the corner should have stopped the fight well beforehand, you know, and shit like that with them. Like, and I'm not saying they did anything to hurt him, because they really were scared and shit like that for his health and shit like that. But I just felt like they could have stopped it a little bit more earlier, you know, and shit like that in that fight, you know, because like Dadashev was already done by like round like 4, you know, and shit like that, you know. I think he got like they stopped it in like round 7 or some shit. As far as in my brain, I'm thinking, but it was but it was like it was still like in that way of like he was done early in that fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. But then like, you know, they still kept it going because it's just like, you know, but it's just more of like. It's just, that's the thing. Boxing is a dangerous sport, man. You know, and shit like that, you know, because he was standing up and he was eating those shots, you know, and he was still throwing back against Subriel Matias, you know, and shit like that, you know, but it's just more of like, you know, but it's just it was too much for Maxim Dadashev, you know, and shit like that, way too much, you know. It was like, but the thing is though, is that it was a good, like, anticipated fight. Because, I mean, Dadashev, you know, like, he was, like, really good coming up in the game. Like, him and Subriel were honestly in the same level, you know, and shit like that. But then, obviously, into the fight, Subriel proved that there's no levels in that fight, you know, and shit like that. And that he was the better man in that fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. But either way, I'm just saying, that was the reason why he didn't really fight that hard in that other fight against that one other. I think his name was Havusian or some shit, or I don't really know and shit like that. You know, it was like something like that, you know, and shit. But you know, but basically that was the guy that one of the guys he lost to, but he had that revenge and put the beats by Dre on that guy. It was like, you know, he made it clear that it was just, you know, the Dadashev fight that shook him and that made him not as hungry anymore. Because, you know, just like when you're a regular person, a good citizen, like, you don't want to kill somebody, you know, and shit like that. I mean, a lot of people are like, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a fight, you know, and shit like that, you know, but it's just, nobody wants that to happen, you know. And, you know, Subriel is a good dude, you know, and shit like that. And he proved, and he didn't, like, that really shook him, you know, and shit like that. From, as a person, like, I can understand that. And a person that would experience probably the same shit, you know, and shit like that, that would, you know, feel like that and shit like that, you know, if that happened, that's the thing, you know, and shit like that, you know. So I understand, you know, and shit like that from Subriel's perspective, you know, and shit like that, you know. All right, so the fighter's record, you know, because I don't, you know, because, you know, I need to start saying fighter's record and shit like that, you know, because, you know, because these predictions are starting to get pretty, you know, intense and shit like that. But starting with the champion, the WBC champion of Alberto Puello, he is 24-0 with 0 draws with 10 knockouts, you know. But do not underestimate his power though, and shit like that, you know, because like, or do not underestimate how like the 10 knockouts, because I mean, at the same time, he can pop and he can drop you and hurt you with his punches, Alberto Puello. But Subriel Brownie Matias, 22 wins with 2 losses, 0 draws, 22 wins coming by way of knockout. And all of his wins coming by way of knockout of Subriel Matias, you know, and stuff like that, you know. So let me repeat, 22-2 with 0 draws, all of his 22 wins coming by way of knockout. So the knockouts are very, very different when it comes down to this fight. But I mean, it was like that against Liam Perot, you know, and shit like that, you know. So that is the thing, you know, and shit like that, you know. And yeah, you know, and shit like that, you know. But yeah, you know, and this can be a very competitive fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. And yeah, man, you know, and shit like that. I mean, like, most boxing fans are gonna, you know, just think that, just know that this fight is just gonna be just really competitive, you know, and shit like that. Or B, just people are gonna know that about Subriel Matias, and those two losses are nothing compared to how, even though like, I mean, you know, like, those two losses isn't really against any, like, big name people. I mean, Liam Perot is a big name in Australia, you know, and shit like that, but, like, he isn't like a name like Manny Pacquiao or like Canelo or Terrence, you know what I mean, you know, and shit like that, you know. But that's the thing, and at least over here in the States, you know, and shit like that, you know, it's probably different. Again, it's different over there in Australia, you know, and shit like that. But the fight didn't happen in Australia, you know, and shit like that, you know. But yeah, man, and shit like that, you know, this is a tough fight, you know, and shit like that. Because if Puello wins this fight, Puello, you know, it's like, either way, Puello is a tough fighter regardless of what happened in that Sandor Martin fight. I feel like that he very much underestimated Sandor Martin, you know, and shit like that, because he really thought he was just gonna walk through Sandor Martin, you know, and shit like that, and he just thought he was levels over Teofimo Lopez, you know, and shit like that, you know. So, like, you know, and that would be still till this day a really good fight. And honestly, between the winner of this fight, you know, and shit like that, I wouldn't mind the winner of this fight fighting Teofimo Lopez, you know, and shit like that, you know. But because they're both evenly matched with Teo. But that's the thing though, and I feel like Puello definitely underestimated Sandor Martin, you know, and shit like that. I mean, obviously you probably knew that Sandor was a tough fighter, but it just, like, you know, like it's just more of like, you know, there wasn't really much in shit like that, you know, to really say that Sandor Martin was all this and that, you know, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And that's the thing, you know, in Puello's favor. So that's why you kind of underestimated Sandor Martin. Guaranteed, if he got in there with Sandor Martin again, he would look a lot more impressive against Sandor Martin. Like, Sandor Martin, once he's getting figured out, all he's gonna do is just move around the ring. He's just gonna nonstop move his feet because his motor is meant to do that, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing and shit, you know. But, you know, as long as, you know, as Puello's making those adjustments and shit like that, that fight, I see that fight being easy work for Puello, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing and shit, you know. And yeah, you know, and shit. So either way, like, if Puello does win this fight, I mean, it overall a redemption from that controversial win against Sandor Martin, you know, and shit like that, you know. But it just, at the same time though, and shit like that, to me, I've been knowing that Alberto Puello is that guy, you know, and shit like that, and that he's really good, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing and shit like that, you know. But yeah. But what these fighters need to do to winning this fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. So we're gonna start with Alberto Puello, you know, and shit like that. You know, we're gonna start with Alberto Puello, you know, and stuff like that, you know, and you know, and basically, with Alberto Puello and shit like that, what he needs to do and shit is just like what Liam Perot did. He needs to be able to move around and shit like that, and keep on moving at a good pace and shit like that, where it's enough where Subriel can't, you know, thought that was a B right there. I don't know what it is, but, you know, like, he needs to do enough where you know, Subriel can't get into his range, you know, where it's going to be making it tough, and where, because anytime where you're boxing really well and shit like that, automatically you're making it where Subriel has to think and shit like that, you know, and he has to, you know, and he basically has to, you know, utilize his own technique and shit like that, you know. Like, he has to utilize his own technique and shit, you know, in an elite fashion, you know, and shit like that, where he's going out of his comfort zone you know, and shit like that. Because whenever people are outboxing him, you know, he doesn't really get very comfortable, you know, and shit like that, you know, and that's the thing, you know, with Subriel Matias, you know, and shit like that, you know, and he doesn't really get very comfortable, you know, and shit like that when it comes down to that, you know, and shit. So if he could, like, the biggest key is to move around to make him uncomfortable, and when he's uncomfortable, you know, and when he's like going forward and shit like that, you know, and shit, like that's the thing and shit like that, you know, like you know, he needs to answer those questions, like counter, you know, like keep on making them feel uncomfortable, you know, and shit like that. Keep testing those moments. Doesn't mean Subriel has all that power, doesn't mean that he can't test those moments in the inside a little bit, you know, and shit like that. You know, he can test those moments in the inside against Subriel, you know, and shit like that, you know. And if he can move around, make him uncomfortable, and then test those moments in the inside, he can easily win this fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing and shit like that. As long as he keeps on knowing what he needs to do to be back on track, on track, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And that's what he needs to do to winning and shit like that, you know, because overall, you know, like he naturally will carry enough, you know, enough power where, you know, Subriel isn't going to want to get hit like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, Subriel most definitely isn't going to want to get hit like that. You know, and shit like that, you know. And that's most definitely the thing and shit like that. He's not going to want to get hit, you know, like that. You know, like, because whenever Subriel's getting hit with a lot of power shots and honestly, and that's been answered in a lot of his fights, more of in the Juke and Bayev fight, where Juke and Bayev, like, besides the Liam Perot fight, like, Juke and Bayev was like his toughest fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing and shit like that, that was his toughest fight, you know, and shit like that, you know, was Juke and Bayev. And Juke and Bayev was really you know, like, he made him shell up, you know, and shit like that, because of the power that Juke and Bayev was having and shit like that, you know. Like, even though in shit like that, Juke and Bayev does carry more power and shit like that than, you know, Alberto Puello, just by a little bit, but still, that shows that how underrated the 10 knockouts are of Subriel Matias. I mean, of Alberto Puello, I mean, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing, you know, and shit like that, you know. Hold up, I'll like, you know, I'm doing something, I'll get to you guys. We back in action and shit like that, you know. But, basically, that's the thing, man, you know, and shit like that, you know. Shit, is this a fresh water? Shit, I'm gonna grab my water from beer back. False alarm, guys, my water's right here. But, yeah, man, but, hold up. But yeah, you know, and stuff like that, you know, but, basically that's what Alberto Puello needs to do, you know, and stuff like that, you know, just, because that's the thing, you know, because with Juke and Bayev has, like, Puello kind of has Juke and Bayev power, you know, and shit like that, you know. Perot did not have, you know, that Juke and Bayev power like that, you know. Again, Puello does, you know, so it's like, that right there, mixing with his boxing skill and him making, you know, Subriel uncomfortable, that should just make him win all those moments, you know, and shit like that. All the moments that he needs to win. When Subriel is in his moments, that's what he can do and shit like that. But it just, you know, but overall and shit like that, I'm not gonna really put it, like, because the reason why, like, I feel like that, you know, like, you know, I wonder if I said this before, you know, and shit like that or not, you know, but the reason why I feel like that Alberto Puello, you know, he lost to why he obviously lost to Sandor Martin, but he won, and shit like that, and why it was controversial was because he obviously underestimated Sandor Martin, and shit like that. He did not think that Sandor Martin, and shit like that, was gonna be, damn, that, like, I love nature, but that bird is kind of like, messing with me a little bit, bro, and shit like that, but it's all good though, and shit like that. But basically, like, that's the thing with Alberto Puello, and shit like that, and, what was I saying and shit like that, hold up. I figured it out. But the reason why, why he lost to, why, he didn't win against, or why that fight against Sandor Martin was controversial, was because he underestimated, Sandor Martin, and shit like that, because it's like, obviously Martin, he gave, like, a really good fight against Teofimo Lopez, but obviously of the level of Alberto Puello, he, like, which, he was being cocky, and shit like that, in his own way, like, just, he, like, thinking that he was gonna win, and shit like that, and when fighters get in that level and shit like that, they do get pretty cocky, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that when it comes down to it, not everybody, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to people that are cocky about it, they do get pretty cocky about it, and shit like that, but that's the thing though and shit like that, if he fought Sandor Martin again and shit like that, it would be like an actual sufficient win for Alberto Puello, and shit like that, because look at, Teofimo Lopez, like, that wasn't, like, a lot of people thought that Teo lost that fight, which in my opinion, I thought Teo edged it, and shit like that, I thought he, like, like, the last, like, 3 rounds, like, he, like, boxed well, and shit like that, and boxed his way into victory, and shit like that, and that's what made him win the fight, and shit like that, but other people just thought he lost and shit, because people didn't know who the fuck, they didn't know who the fuck Sandor Martin was, but hold up. That's the thing, man, and shit like that. Like, when he fought Teofimo Lopez and shit like that, like, that's the thing, man, but I thought he won that fight. But either way and shit like that, Puello, and shit like that, like, I'm not gonna blame that, like, the whole Sandor Martin thing on, on Puello at all. I'm not gonna blame it on Puello at all, because this shit ain't hitting at all. It's more because it's, like, more rough, shit like that stuff, so it's, like, or I'm just gonna say, it's more rough weed, shit like that, and shit, like, I didn't break it, like, down very properly, I mean, it's better, I'm starting to break it down better, but it just, I need to break it down, like, a little bit more properly, and shit like that, but that's the thing, though, but that's the thing, with Puello, and shit like that, is that, like, is that he's a really good fighter, a very good fighter, and I am a fan of Puello, and shit like that, And the one thing that I called is that heading into that fight against what's his name, against Gary Antoine Russell, I had Gary Antoine Russell, I had Alberto Puello winning that fight, and he was a significant underdog. Like, he was like a 3-1 underdog in that fight, and nobody thought he was gonna win that fight. But I believed in Puello, and I went with it and shit like that, and he showed enough for me to pick Puello, and shit like that. I got something on my shirt, but for me to pick Puello in that fight, and he showcased a lot, and I was already a fan before he fought Gary Antoine Russell, but Would he beat, Gary Antoine Russell? Would he beat Gary Antoine Russell, and shit like that? It's like, that's when I became really more of a fan of him, and shit like that. And he boxed beautifully in that fight against Gary Antoine Russell. And look at Gary Antoine Russell. Like, he literally beat Ryo, bro, and shit like that. Like, I am just saying, bro, like, he literally beat Ryo, and shit like that. Like, and I understand, like, people are like, oh, Ryo, this and that, Ryo is still a good fighter. Wait till these fighters are going to start beating better oppositions, and then it's going to start accumulating, you know what I mean? And shit like that, and then you're going to start seeing how truly good Ryo is, and shit like that. I should have Radio Raheem right here, bro. But I'm just saying, though, it's shit like that, because no matter what, this ain't for kids, it's shit like that, I think most of these channels aren't really for kids, it's shit like that, but yeah, that's the thing, you feel me? And, like, he literally beat Ryo, Gary Antoine Russell, and he schooled Ryo, too, and shit like that. But heading into that fight, though, I mean, most people had Gary Antoine Russell winning that fight, but I ain't gonna lie, though, like he has a big fan base, Gary Antoine Russell. I mean, the whole Russell squad, Gary Russell, fucking Gary Antonio Russell, fucking Gary Antoine Russell, and shit like that, like, literally, like, there's so many Gary, like, Russells and shit like that. I feel like they just be called from their middle names besides the original, and shit like that, I bet you that's how it is, and shit like that, like, because how would it be like Gary, but anyways, and shit like that, but I'm just saying, like, that fan base is huge and shit like that, but I'm a real boxing fanatic and shit like that, but overall and shit like that, heading into that Ryo fight, I had, I had, Gary Antoine Russell winning that fight, and shit like that, like, I had Gary Antoine Russell, winning that fight, and shit like that. I just felt like that, shit, I would have had Puello, outboxing Ryo, and shit like that, but it's just more of that, Antoine Russell, he's strong, he got strong boxing skill, and shit like that, and he just is more well calculated and shit like that, I mean, I wouldn't say more well calculated, I just feel like that it's just like, he just looks more better, and shit like that, and it's just, anything he does is just gonna look more better, and shit like that, against somebody like Ryo, it would it would have been nothing like anything like fighting Isaac Cruz. Isaac would have, probably would have got, I mean, I don't know about stopped, because Isaac is a tough fight. I mean, if Gervonta could have not stopped Isaac, and Isaac hasn't been stopped ever since, nor even dropped, and shit like that, it's like, it's not really, I don't think, Gary Antoine Russell would have done anything, but he would have definitely would have caught, Isaac with some clean punches. He would have beat Isaac Cruz like in a clean match, and shit like that, in a clean boxing lesson. I would have had Gary Antoine Russell winning that fight, and shit like that, but but then that's the thing though, and shit like that, and and then basically that's the thing and shit like that, and and yeah, and shit like that, hold on, I gotta get back on my train of thought and shit like that, basically and shit like that, like, that's the thing and shit, and, and, but back onto the topic with Puello, and shit like that, Puello, like, he beat Gary Antoine Russell, and he swept that boy. I will rewatch that shit in the crib, and shit like that again, and I will tell you, and I will just walk down here and say that he schooled him, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And that's the thing, with Puello. But on to Subriel Brownie Matias. You know, like, but I'm gonna just say for that for Alberto Puello. Alberto Puello. You know, I should be an announcer, my nigga, like literally, like I'm just saying, bruh. You know, I'm just saying, bruh. But yeah, I'm gonna give me just a little bit of a break. But yeah, man. But yeah, on to Subriel Matias. You know, and shit like that. Got something in my eye. Hold up. But yeah, you know, but on to Subriel Matias, you know, and shit like that, you know. But basically, you know, with Subriel Matias, you know, and shit like that, you know what Subriel Matias needs to do, you know, and shit like that, you know, to win this fight and shit, you know, is that like, you know, he needs to be able to, you know, is that overall, you know, he needs to be able to, you know, to, cut into the distance, you know, and shit like that, you know, of Alberto Puello, you know, and shit like that, you know, like he needs to cut into the distance of Alberto Puello, you know, and shit like that, you know, because. Oh, but the thing is though is that Alberto, he's a long fighter, but Subriel is also a lengthy fighter too, but you know, and shit like that, you know, and he does use a good skill of basically like utilizing the reach and shit like that, you know, and shit like that, you know, with this pressure fighting and shit, you know, but yo, I picked my note, but it's all good, but that's the thing and shit like that, you know, so. But I just feel like when it comes down to it, he's not going to really have very much success into really getting the reach of what he wants and shit like that, you know, against you know, Alberto Puello. But, you know, at the same time, though, and shit like that, he needs to try. Because it's like he needs to show, you know, something, you know, against you know, Alberto Puello, that you know is gonna make Alberto Puello think different things and shit like that, you know, and shit, you know, and be like, oh shit, you know, and then basically you're countering and then you're doing whatever you're doing and then he's looking and then Subriel's looking better, you know, and shit like that, you know, but that's the thing and shit like that, you know, but you know he does need to utilize the kind of like the reach a little bit, but overall and shit like that, you know, and shit is that like Subriel just needs to do what he needs to do, you know, and shit like that, you know, it's like every moment for Subriel is a moment to attack, you know, and shit like that, and that's the one thing that's not for you know, for Alberto Puello, you know, and shit like that. Not every moment for Alberto Puello is a moment for him to attack, you know, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing and shit like that. Not every moment is a moment for him to attack, you know, and shit like that, you know. Because, and especially like against, you know, Subriel, you know, Subriel had like every moment, you know, like Puello has to watch out until before he just like he gets hit way too much, and it's just more of like it's like, you know, it just he's too rattled for him to be able to move, and too siphoned, you know, from the body shots and everything and the pain for him to be able to just do what he wants to do. Because that's what Subriel does. It's just like he breaks you down mentally with his power and shit like that, you know, and it makes it hard, you know, for you to be able to do what you want to do and shit like that, you know, because he's literally just breaking you down with his power, you know, and shit like that, you know. And that's the thing with Subriel Matias, you know, and shit like that, you know. But yeah, you know, it's shit like that with Subriel Matias. You know, it's shit like that, you know. So it's like he could pick any moment, you know, shit like that. You know, if he's in distance, he could just shoot the jab, you know, shit like that. Find ways to get that jab going, because he has a beautiful jab, Subriel. Like, Subriel has a beautiful jab, and he does a beautiful job at setting up his punches, you know, and shit like that, you know. So he's able to do that, you know, and shit like that. Set up the jab, you know, and shit like that, you know, and basically, you know, and then basically, you know, like punch to the forehead and just keep on jabbing to the forehead, jab to the side of the face, you know, and shit like that, you know, and shit like that, kind of like a lengthy hook, you know, and shit like that, you know, like like, he can do all of that shit, and shit like that, to be able to walk him down, and then be able to do that, get into the inside, and shit like that, throw his combinations, break Puello down, and shit like that, and obviously he could fight in the inside against Puello, and shit like that, where he could just beat Puello up in the inside, and shit like that, but, and that's the thing and shit like that, but the one thing with Subriel is that he needs to recognize that, like, a lot of these fighters that he's going to be fighting now is going to be having really good athleticism, where even better athleticism than he does, and this is a fight where, where Subriel, he's fighting somebody with better, athleticism, and shit like that, with footwork, with boxing skill, and shit like that, with more, like, with all around with, like, movement, I would say, like, and shit like that, of Alberto Puello, and shit like that, so it's like, that's something that's definitely gonna be, a really, a big factor, and shit. But it just, as long as he can be able to still commit, he's gonna have all the success of what he needs to have, and shit like that, because he has quick footwork, like that's the, like I wouldn't say he has quick boxing footwork, and shit like that, but I mean, like, but Subriel at the end of the day has quick footwork, and shit like that, and definitely has quick enough, and he has quick footwork, and shit like that. It's just he's not crafty with his footwork, but when he needs to come forward and shit like that to throw his punches and shit like that, like he's gonna, like, know what he needs to do to then land his punches and shit like that, and then basically get into the inside and throw his punches, and shit like that, Subriel overall has more tools in this fight and shit like that than Alberto Puello, and shit like that, because because Puello, he can fight in the inside too. I mean, it showed against Batir Akhmedov, and shit like that, I mean, he's kind of like a French contender, and shit like that, Batir Akhmedov, shit like that, little, like he's more of, like, kind of a bit of a gatekeeper, I would say, Batir Akhmedov, and shit like that. I don't even know if he even still fights no more, but that's the thing, though, and shit like that, is that, like, what about Batir Akhmedov? Oh, yeah. Is that, he was fighting in the inside very well against Batir Akhmedov, but no matter what and shit like that, at the end of the day and shit like that, that's what Subriel does best at, is where you become vulnerable and then you just want to fight and shit like that, and fight in the inside and shit like that, and overall just fight. And shit like that. But what I'm saying right now is fighting the inside, and that's where he's gonna quickly give you a 10-piece combination and possibly drop you, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, and overall in that Liam Perot fight again and shit like that, like, I felt like that he won the fight, and shit like that. I felt that Subriel Matias did enough to winning that fight, and shit like that, like, he did enough to winning that fight, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit, and stuff like that, he did enough to winning that fight, and shit like that, for surely, he did enough to winning that fight, and shit like that, Subriel, because it's just more of, like, I just feel like, if you want to really just credit Liam Perot like that, all you're going to really credit about is more just, he was running the whole time, bro. I mean, he was still fighting. He was still in there fighting, but it just, he wasn't having any punches, like, that was really, like, any thud like that, and shit like that. But it was still enough for him to look good. But I mean, against Subriel Matias, and shit like that, I don't know, and shit like that, in my own personal opinion, and shit like that, like, that's the thing and shit. I mean, overall and shit like that, I mean, like, I'm a real boxing fanatic, but I mean, at the end of the day, with that, you could call me a little bit biased, but either way, it's like, you can't call me biased for them to just give that fucking decision to Liam Perot, and shit like that. Like, they could have gave that fight a damn draw, and shit like that. That was a close ass fight, and shit like that, and I'm just saying, and shit like that. I'm just saying, like, that was a very close fight, and shit like that. And I felt like Liam Perot didn't, and I feel like Subriel, if somebody was the winner, I feel like Subriel did enough to winning that fight, and shit like that, and that's the thing, and shit like that, But on to my final prediction for this fight. Let's go. Alright, so prediction time, man. Let's get it. So, the early rounds, I have the early and mid rounds being even 2-2. So overall, heading into the later rounds, I have it being 4-4. But overall, and shit like that, the later rounds, I do see Subriel, overall, I do see Subriel securing, the later rounds, and shit like that, and securing the victory, and shit like that, because overall, this is a very, very, very tough fight, and shit like that, it's not that it's an easy prediction. It's just more because I know how both of these fighters are, and shit like that, but it's just more just like, easily going like if you're just going with with who's gonna win, like it's almost like who's gonna win the last round, and shit like that, I'm pretty sure most people are gonna pick Subriel Matias, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, but more in a complex way, I see him taking, all of the later rounds, and shit like that. Maybe, Alberto Puello, shit like that could, win a round in the later rounds, but either way, to get a winner, he ain't gonna win any more than a round in that round, in those rounds, and shit like that, so overall and shit like that, I have Subriel Matias winning this fight by a decision and shit like that. I don't really know like by what decision. If I would pick a decision, I probably would say a majority decision, because I know there's gonna be that, because it's gonna be a tough ass fight. A very, very tough fight in my eyes. And if that's the case, the scenario, there's going to be that one judge, and shit like that, that's just gonna wanna score the fight a draw, and shit like that. But then two other judges are gonna score in favor of Subriel Matias, and shit like that. I'm not saying for the judges to do that at all. I'm just saying I'm predicting what your thought, what the decision's gonna be, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, but yeah, and shit like that, this is gonna be a good fight, and shit like that. Out of all the fights on that card, and shit like that, this is the fight that I'm most excited about, and shit like that, is Alberto Puello defending his WBC belt against Subriel Brownie Matias, and shit like that. The former I think he used to have a belt. I think he was like the former IBF champion, I believe, and shit like that. I believe he was, and shit like that. Yeah, I think he was like the former like IBF champion, or some shit, and stuff like that, But then the one time he defended that belt, because that was when he quickly got the belt, and then he defended it, and shit like that, which again, I thought he beat, Liam Perot, if you're gonna pick a winner, and shit like that, and shit like that, in my honest opinion, if you're gonna pick a winner, because overall, like, I feel like the more feminine answer and shit like that, and shit, would be, Liam Perot, and shit like that, and shit, I mean, well, not Liam Perot, sorry, but a draw, I'm a little high, and shit like that, but Subriel Matias, and shit like that, that's basically who I think would, what was I saying and shit like that, that's who I think who would have won that fight if it came down to it, but overall, I feel like the more feminine answer would be a draw, and shit like that, but, so, he can at least keep his belt, Subriel Matias, and shit like that, and that's the thing, and shit like that, but overall and shit like that, I'm predicting Subriel to take, Alberto Puello's belt. You never know what can happen, and shit like that, but overall, not just to take Alberto Puello's belt, but to give Alberto Puello his first loss of his career, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, and he can at least be the person to land his first L. But let's see, man. Let's see if this fight can, let's see if he can do that. Because overall and shit like that, if I'm rooting for somebody to win in this fight, Alberto Puello, I love you, bro. I love you. Like, keep on doing what you doing, bro. But literally, like, I'm riding with Brownie Matias, bro. You know, and shit like that. You know, it's like, at the same time, though, and shit like that. If I would, like, I'm gonna vote for both guys. But at the same time, I'm really down in deep down, you know, in like in my heart, I'm going for Subriel Matias. You know, but my prediction is 210% unbiased, you know, and shit like that, you know, and that's the thing and shit like that, because I'm a fan of, first and foremost, both fighters and shit like that, and second of all, I'm an unbiased boxing channel, you know, and shit like that, you know, everything here on my boxing channel is unbiased, you know, and shit like that, you know, and that's the thing. But yeah, man, but I'm just gonna end the video there, you know, shit like that, you know. I got, you know, it's gonna be a very, very tough fight, but I do got Subriel Matias sneaking away with the victory, you know, and taking away Alberto Puello's WBC belt, you know, and stuff like that, you know. I hope you guys enjoyed this prediction. I hope there's not too much controversy with this. You know, I hope it's all love, you know, at the end of the day when it comes down to this prediction, you know, and shit like that, you know, because no matter what, with any prediction that I'm doing, it's always all love. It's always all love no matter what, you know, and shit like that. You know, no matter what it is, it's always all love, you know, and shit like that. You know, like, even if it's competitive, it's always all love, you know, and shit like that, you know, and especially for Alberto Puello, you know, and shit like that, you know. It's all love, man, you know, and shit like that, you know, but at the end of the day and shit like that, I'm gonna rock with the homie Brownie Matias in this fight. But man, I can be proved wrong in this, you know, and shit like that. I most definitely can be proved wrong, because no matter who loses in this fight and shit like that, it's a fair loss and shit like that, and they're both still gonna be competitive fighters and still are gonna be disruptive in the division, you know, and shit like that, unless the people are wanting to disrespect the division and shit like that, because there's not really any true competitor like that, but it's just more of like, you know, but it just, you get what you get, you feel me, you know, and you never know, a true competitor can still lose against against another fighter, you know, and shit like that. Anything can happen in the sport of boxing. But yeah, man, but thank you all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Peace out, man.